I'm Pat Stevens, and I'm with the Lucas County Board of Developmental Disabilities.
And I'm Steve Mentrek with Bittersweet Farms.
What we're going to talk about today is going to deal with individuals with developmental disabilities and the risk of them being trafficked. And part of those reasons are vulnerabilities, coercion, fraud, and manipulation.
So to start, we like to identify those risk factors for individuals with developmental disabilities. They're very similar to those of individuals without disabilities, but due to some of the developmental delays, comprehension, and disabilities themselves, it oftentimes will put those individuals at higher risks for exploitation, manipulation, and victimization. A lot of this is due to a number of different factors, from the ability to tell who's safe and who has that individual's best intentions in mind when interacting with others, but also social barriers or lack of natural relationships that will over time keep these individuals isolated and less connected with those in the community that have their best interest in mind. Oftentimes too, we run into battles where school systems who are unable to accommodate their individual needs or even to take into consideration some of the learning experiences that we should expect are failing the individuals with students with disabilities. One in particular we found over the past 5 years is the premise of sex education in the field of those with developmental disabilities and special education. It is very rare that we found any school system that has prioritized sex education of their students on IEPs or students with developmental disabilities. And I don't think it's because of any other reason than they haven't been challenged to think in that way yet. But without this education and early on understanding of sex relationships and those types of things, it will put our individuals at a lot more risk because they're not educated to the extent they need to be. There's also some common views that exist out in the community that individuals with developmental disabilities are not sexually active. This is something that over time we have come to learn that it is completely inaccurate, and if they're a person, they've probably had some sort of either sexual advice, sexual interaction, or some sort of understanding that they gained from, whether it be the media, TV, movies, or friends. This exposure is out there, so we can't sit back on this idea that somebody's not exposed to this or this is not an area of their life.
And Steve, one thing with our own family, because I have a sister, my oldest sister has a developmental disability. And so we were that typical common view family that she definitely was not sexually active. Well, she's 70 at this point in time, and I don't think we would bother to even ask her if she was, because she probably really would tell us it was none of our business. But we actually were a common view family. We didn't think about her being sexually active. Okay, and some additional actual factors is social powerlessness. And I think because our individuals have always been very sheltered, that they really don't think socially that they can actually integrate. When really they can integrate if they are taught some of the rules about how to be social but not be in danger with being social. Then there's a lot of communication skill deficits. And one of the deficits that we see right now, which is one of the biggest ones with our individuals, is computer systems and cell phones, because they really have not been taught how to use either one of those medias. And so that can cause a lot of deficits, because what they do is they want friends. They want someone to be their friend. And so they'll befriend anybody that's on a computer system, and that's going to also show some interest. And there's also like a lack of instruction or resources. So it kind of diminishes their ability to protect themselves. And so as they continue to go out in the community more, because they are independent now, it's the way our rules are telling us we have to make sure that they have lives just like ours. So it's a lot of education on ensuring and giving them resources to understand how they can protect themselves as they are going into the community. And also, it's hard for them to detect who should they be safe around. Because like I said, everybody wants to have friends. They want to have friends like we have friends. And so we really have to be able to make sure that we teach them how to detect if somebody is doing something wrong to them, that that's not going to work that way. We really want to make sure that they understand if someone is sexually abusing you, it's wrong. If they're verbally abusing you, it's wrong, or even physically abusing you, it's wrong. Because we have like some of the highest percentages across the country as well as the world when it comes to abuse, when it comes to our population, because they cannot detect who to be safe around.
And one thing that I think fuels this fire a lot is, I can just thinking back to individual service plans. These are plans that we put together through a team of people that help the individuals. And within those plans, oftentimes you'll have individuals putting at the top of their priority list those boyfriends, girlfriends, relationships as being a primary function that they want to find in their life. And that's what I think really puts them at a higher risk than anybody else, because they're willing to do and take anything that puts them in that relationship, whether it's right, wrong, or they're kind of indifferent to it because it's meeting that basic need of, this is somebody that says they love me or has a value for me. And that is something I think that we as presenters and as a system, we want to encourage community connections, but we have to find a safe way to introduce people to the right people, understand what it is okay and not okay to give of yourself in a relationship, whether it be an intimate one or a employment one. So some other risk factors for those with developmental disabilities, there's a lot of discrimination and exclusion because many places view DD and mental health as something that they can't protect against themselves for. So because of that, there's misunderstandings, misconceptions of the individuals and what all they should be connected to and where they're going. Governments are slowly starting to recognize the risk factors and making provisions to include individuals with DD as a part of their anti-trafficking efforts. This hasn't always been the case. It hasn't been until the past couple of years that we've actually seen this demographic included in some of the annual reports and surveys. But we also feel that it's an under-identified population because many of the folks that we've gone through working with or talked to over the years, if they were under the age of 21 and going through, say, some sort of trafficking incident where now they have a cognitive disability due to traumatic brain injury from the physical abuse that they had, this now puts that individual in the scope of DD community, the developmental disability community, with that traumatic brain injury diagnosis. So we're seeing some growth in that area as far as supports, recognition of the issue, but still have a long way to go. Stigmas and marginalization of the DD and mental health often create particular vulnerabilities. Now that things are identified of commonalities amongst those with developmental disabilities and mental health, it's a lot easier of a onboarding or grooming phase, you could say, for the sex or labor trafficking at this point in time. And traffickers are recognizing this. They're also seeing other resources and benefits that are tied to individuals with developmental disabilities, which also increases or incentivizes them to being victims. Some of those are things such as food stamps, access to HUD low-income housing, there's a whole bunch of social support dollars, social security checks, things like that, that traffickers realize this is added income, added resources that they don't have to exploit the individual for through their acts, but more of exploitation of behind the scenes coordination. Human trafficking numbers are difficult to acquire with developmentally disabled. Many have not been counted due to a lack of reporting. In 2015, Disability Rights Ohio, it's a nonprofit legal group in Ohio, put together a report that just looked at sexual abuse and sexual misconduct where those with developmental disabilities were victims. And we were looking at percentages above 89% of the population being taken advantage of or abused in one way, shape, or form over the course of their life. That percentage is extremely high when you look at the grand population, the greater community. And that also shows that when this is something I've gone through in my life and within the disability world is something that they've often experienced and not been able to advocate about, that it becomes more normalized over time. So stepping outside of those boundaries and being put into situations that make you uncomfortable, it's already like that legwork has been done earlier on in these individuals' lives. Individuals are also deemed incompetent sometimes to be witnesses to these offenses. And this is, legally speaking, any individual that would have a court-appointed or state-appointed guardian meets certain criteria where they do not have the level of understanding, detail, or things like that that they can provide a valid witness statement or to even stand up in a court of law and provide their story. This, you know, granted, we've seen it where it's worked, where people can provide some stories and they give you the idea of what happened, but when it comes down to those details that hold up in law, we've seen where the time frame may be off, or where maybe the details are miscommunicated, or there's a piece of it that they didn't understand. Those can get eaten up in the court of law, and that's why they oftentimes will have court-appointed advocates that will help to support the individual telling their story, learning through active listening and detail coordination to really paint the picture for them when their voice legally can't be heard in that stance.
And kind of piggybacking off of what Steve just said, persons with disabilities are more likely to be victims of violence or rape, according to a British study back in 2004. And like we said, it's very hard to even obtain like police intervention, legal protection, or preventive care for our individuals once something like that happens to them. Because in most cases with our individuals, it's hard to get that story out of them because they need to make sure that there's somebody around them that's trusting. Because if not, they're not going to really talk to you. And Steve, when we kind of get a little bit more in our presentation, we'll talk a little bit about some of the females that we had to deal with. But women and girls with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to abuse because, as he said, we're talking a high 80% number of individuals that have been abused. And we're talking about abuse with some of the victims that we had as early as of age 3. So that becomes a very customary thing that's going on with them because it's something that they're very used to. And then a survey in Orissa, India found that virtually all of the women and girls with disabilities were beaten at home. 25% of the women had intellectual disabilities. They had been raped. At least 6% of them, the women with disabilities, have been forcibly sterilized. So the research indicates that violence against children and disabilities occurs at an annual rate at least 1.7 times greater than for the peers without disabilities. And another kind of a caveat that goes along with this, and Steve can answer to this too, what we're observing with our population is that our population is changing. They look exactly like we do. You can it's only certain cases now you'll be able to distinguish that that person has a disability compared to someone who doesn't. So our population definitely is definitely changing.
Absolutely. One of the victims we worked with in the past, just to give a kind of idea, on the street walking down, you would never be able to point her as being any different than anybody else. The problem was when you got into conversation, you could really see the disability based off her responses. You know, I'll get into some of that here in a little bit with a little story. So signs of human trafficking for those with developmental disabilities. These are all very much the same as what you would see in any other person that is being trafficked. A lot of prior abuse in the home, including sexual abuse. They may have had involvement with county children's services. They could have been in a home where one or both of the parents were abusing drugs. They could have had a history of running away from home or involvement in illegal activities. Drug usage is also common, whether it be by choice or by force. That's something that we've seen used as a controlling mechanism within some of our population as well. Another area is having new items that they could not afford or things that just don't make sense. All these by themselves, you know, one at a time could be other issues. But again, when you look at somebody with a developmental disability, it's not so much what they're going to come and tell you is going on, it's how you do your legwork of investigating, looking into the scenario and the details of any one of these topics here, so that way you can really uncover the real issues going on and not just the surface issues that may be visible to everybody else.
In quite a few of the cases that we had, a lot of those young women, they were running away. They were trying to get away from their actual perpetrators, but it wasn't very successful. And so there's been, like you said, a lot of studies that have impacted human trafficking with individuals with developmental disabilities, because not every county board has become involved like Lucas County Board of DD. We have 88 counties which are in Ohio, and we train quite a few of them. But if you still look at it, the sexual issue with our individuals is still a taboo issue. We still have some county boards that may not agree that there's things that are going on, where some of the other ones, they're kind of very jumping on it. They want to know as much information as they can in order to assist and help individuals who have gone through this situation. Then there's like global studies, and they've shown in other countries that social services are not in place like they are with the United States. Because the United States, our social service systems are pretty large. Most of every state that I'm aware of, they have a DD system, or they have a board that deals with mental health and developmental disabilities. But you don't see that in a lot of your global studies. That's something that does not occur there. The children from impoverished families who have been promised that they will be educated and can work, they usually end up in brothels, organized begging rings, and factories. This is the type of things that happen more globally than here, but we do have some stories about some labor trafficking issues as well as sex trafficking here. So if it's an impoverished family and they're looking at money, sometimes that's how they end up getting caught up in this situation, because it is about money when they're selling their sons or daughters, because it only does not pertain to just females. And UNICEF sent some information, and they claim that, they have a concern with deaf girls and women, because they're deliberately targeted due to they cannot report is what they think when they're being victimized. And this is part of Ye's 2009 study. But the thing is, now there are interpreters who can assist, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's happening globally, because it's not. Because if we get a deaf victim, we're going to be able to support that deaf victim.
I'd like to jump in too and add, even with those individuals that have other developmental disabilities, more cognitive based, they have communication barriers of their own as well, whether it's using the right words so we understand what they're trying to tell us, whether it's just getting across and having that verbal communication, things that we take for granted. They might not be able to put together the full story in a clear way that we would always be able to understand and interpret. So there is a lot of looking for external resources for people that are familiar working with them and know them personally, to be kind of an interpreter on that level so that we can get accurate statements and information.
And then most of common characteristics of not reporting is because of physical harm of their families. We had a case where they were actually threatening the family. So the actual individual, she did not want to have any harm done to her family. So there's like a lot of control that they'll place on our individuals also. And usually our DD system, at one point in time before human trafficking even became a terminology within our agency, it was looked at as sexual abuse, sexual assault, and mistreatment. And see, I'm the director that's over the major and unusual incident department at our county board. And I will guarantee you, if we went back and looked at some of the history of the situations that were going on, we would have termed them as human trafficking and not sexual abuse, assault, or mistreatment. So right here, I would like for Steve to kind of tell you a little bit of a story about why it's so difficult when it comes to reporting individuals that have developmental disabilities and terminology, because we did have a situation where we knew what she was talking about, but when there were questions asked of her, her interpretation was totally different, and luckily they were there because it definitely did save her life.
All right, well, this is kind of like the intro, my intro by fire to human trafficking. Pat and I met with our leadership team one morning at about 10 in the morning, talking about this topic of human trafficking and what type of training we need to put in place, because we feel it's a growing issue and we need to learn more. Well, an hour later, this young lady who we had been working with walked in, had a conversation with us behind closed doors, and basically came out and said, "I'm being forced to sleep with people and I don't want to do it anymore." Okay, so right there, that was our start. That was our training. Let's start running. And we couldn't have picked a better opportunity to train through. Granted, I never want anybody to have to experience this, but we had a lot of luck and blessings on our side throughout this process, and it helped us learn a lot, which is why we've kind of taken this approach to educate and advocate on this issue across the state of Ohio. So anyways, one thing that once we found this out, obviously we want to help her get to safety. Immediate resource you go to in your head is clothing, shelter, food. Okay, we're going to go to the YWCA. We're going to look at some other domestic violence shelters and see who we can pull together to get this young lady some support. One of the processes when you're going to any one of these shelters is you have to do an intake and eligibility assessment. Within that, you sit down with somebody, they ask you some formal questions so that they can check off the answers on their form and say you qualify and now you can stay. Well, while sitting in there, the assessor was having a good conversation and then got to this point where it said, when was the last time you were sexually abused? And I'll never forget, the young lady looked at the assessor like she had two heads and said, what the hell are you talking about? I've never been sexually abused. And I kind of looked at her and thought for 1 second, no, reframe this for her. She didn't get it. I said, when was the last time you had your hands tied behind your back or your eyes blindfolded? She goes, oh, yesterday. The story behind that is when she gave us the details to her situation, part of the process before she was trafficked was they would take her from the house that she was staying in, blindfold her, tie her hands behind her back, put her in the back seat of a car, drive around for about an hour, unload her into a garage where she'd perform sex acts for numerous hours on numerous men, and then repeat the process to go back home. So when I said, when was the last time that you were blindfolded or tied up, and she normalized it as, oh, that was yesterday, like this is nothing new, this is just what I go through, it showed that she had no understanding of what sexual abuse was. She's adapted her mentality to her situation for survival's sake. But then when you can put it into a relatable term that she truly understood and thinks innocently about it, without that word abuse that sounds so rough and harsh and maybe has some things I'll have to answer to after this, she was able to normalize it and just say, oh, this was yesterday, meaning yesterday I was taken out and sexually abused. But we never would have gotten that had we not have stopped, interpreted the question, helped her understand, and then relayed what that meant to the assessor, which ultimately then allowed her access then to getting the resources and support she needed. So again, when we continue on, there's so many other factors that individuals with DD have experienced sexual abuse. Most of them have been from somebody who knows them, whether it's a family member, a friend of the family. There's residential care staff, transportation providers, personal care attendants. That group right there is a group of professionals that most community members don't have those types of interactions with, but they're very intimate, trust-based relationships that puts a lot on the individual trusting who's coming in to provide that service for them. And unfortunately, there are situations around the world that these trusted professional staff have taken advantage of those individuals and put them into situations where they were trafficked, and whether it be through labor trafficking or sex trafficking. So the whole thing, this idea of dependency, these individuals with developmental disabilities have dependencies on others, but the dependency can't be isolated to just one other person. We need teams of people, those family members and friends that have the individual's best interest to be a part of this, because anytime we allow it to be one person's input, we're just allowing that one person to take advantage of the situation as long as nobody else is checking in. Other situations like boyfriends and girlfriends or other authority figures have also been a part of these abusive relationships, and contribute to some of that delinquency of their mentality of thinking these are the things that I'm okay with and have to be okay with to get what I need. And as we all know, that's just not the right way to groom somebody into the situation.
And when we talk with our individuals, the things that we need to make sure we're asking them are some detailed questions. So, and the reason why we do that is, and that interpretation is so important, we have to understand they're only going to give us a surface view. So that terminology, which is the mantra of human trafficking, you definitely do have to look beneath the surface, or you'll never find out the truth. So if you have like a suspicion of anybody that is has a developmental disability that's being trafficked, if you believe that, then the person you ought to know is in immediate danger. So you should call the police. You can contact our county board or your county boards in any of the 88 counties. You do not need full proof to file a report. And all states have laws requiring professionals to report. Now, one thing, we work with the task force, the FBI task force, and when it comes to our population, if it's reported, then they take the case, because our population is one of the most vulnerable populations, and they're going to look at those cases because they're people who really cannot defend themselves.
Yeah, they definitely look at it as a protected class, just as much so as they would a minor. For the simple fact that the same vulnerabilities that exist for many minors are the same vulnerabilities that would exist for our population.
Just because you may have a female that might be 33, she may look like she's 17 or 18, but her cognitive level may have an IQ that's way below 90. So then you have the Department of Developmental Disabilities has the Major Unusual Incident Department, which is when I was explaining that I'm over. And we also have a registry unit that's there, which provides oversight to all of our county boards and our providers. And we are to assure health and safety of our individuals when they're receiving services. It's not an option, but it's something that we have to do. We also have our unit do incident tracking systems, and they use this at all the county boards because we're responsible for providing immediate action if this is happening. We have to do an investigation, and we have to do prevention planning for each of these incidents, because what they're considered are Protocol A cases. Those cases have to be looked at within 24 hours. And so we want to get the information right when it's real essential, and then we work the case until we either can get the police involved, the feds involved, or whatever different charges through law enforcement have to be implemented.
One important thing to note is if there is an individual with a developmental disability or a younger victim under 21 that had a TBI or other injuries like that, you always want to reach out to any of the disability resources in your local area, because with that population, there are federal and state funding that backs up the additional resources and support that those individuals may require to live on their own independently, to work on their own independently, or just to integrate with other service delivery systems like counseling, trauma-informed care, mental health type supports as well. But never go into it alone. Know that those with disabilities have a number of challenges, that you are going to want a team of professionals really from a diverse group of entities to really look at the whole picture, because not one group's going to have all the answers. The mental health, as well as the DD, as well as the law enforcement, have to work collaboratively and in sync in these situations, because fear is such a heavy force that's used with our individuals, because it's easy for them to believe the situations and the things that they are told will happen to them or will occur if they don't follow along with the rules, which makes it very difficult for us when trying to work with them and support them. So some other victim experiences. I mentioned the assessments and the questioning, and how we really have to listen to the whole story to then help that person interpret and tell that story moving forward. You have some other immediate support needs of victims. Like I had mentioned, domestic violence shelters are great and being a place that's available, but many times domestic violence shelters expect the victims that are coming there to be more independent, to be able to cook their own meals, to go out grocery shopping and purchase their own things, to utilize public transportation independently, to do their daily living needs, activities of daily living, ADL care. But in reality, our population, those are things that are barriers to many of the individuals that we support. So putting a person in a domestic violence shelter might get them out of the immediate health and safety risk, but it's going to put them in a greater, a worse off situation, because there is nobody at a domestic violence shelter that's geared to walking you through and giving that direct daily support for those extra needs. So working through the county board systems, this is where your link becomes to help those individuals get the providers and professional support that they need for shopping, for meal preparation, for daily care needs. And it's totally unique to the disability system and not necessarily the domestic violence system. They also would work very heavily, the county boards, with the trauma-informed care counseling and helping to integrate those mental health supports while we front load all of those resources for the day-to-day support. Long-term support options, it can be a variety of things. I mean, a lot of it is funding related. It could be anything from relocating to another county to reassigning staff to a number of different things. But in the long term, the first step to engaging with any of these options is the involvement with your County Board of Developmental Disabilities or your local disability support system that's through your local governments. Without that connection, you're going to be treading uphill battle basically, and it doesn't get easier without the extra support.
And something that we also were going to cover just briefly, we didn't do any slides or anything on it, dealt with labor cases. So I'm just going to do kind of like a quick bleed of just some cases that we unfortunately have had. There were 2 men with intellectual disabilities forced on a labor and dairy farm, which was in Michigan. And as you know, that's involuntary servitude. So they threatened them with physical threats and also with legal coercion to keep them there. And that particular case started putting some trafficking laws in place. Then we had another situation where there were 55 Mexican nationals who were deaf, and they were forced to bag and sell trinkets in New York City subway. And that was one of the first cases in the United States recognized as human trafficking.
And there's a number of other ones too out there. One I really like to share, if you ever get a chance, the Men of Atalissa. It's a very certain case that talked about a turkey farm where these gentlemen worked for over 30 years for little to nothing. It was a work release program paired with a residential provider program that once management changed course in this, of the house and supporting the guys on the job, that's where the problems began, because who they put into place was not having any oversight from the state systems or local systems that fund these resources, and the quality of living became less of a support model and more of a restraint model, where he kept them in their homes and did not allow others to come from the community to visit them. Would force them to work in live and work in unsanitary conditions, doing jobs that nobody else out there would want to do. And at the end of the day, they were able to write off all of the wages earned by the individuals as in-kind contributions for the services that they provided to the men that lived at this house. I highly, highly, highly recommend, if you ever want to get a good visual, they did a great job on that as far as presenting the case, presenting the issue, and how it went from something that was great in the beginning and well-intended, and then swayed by the people who were in charge of it and their kind of need and willingness to do whatever it took to get the job done and to make money on their own.
And the next case that we had is another one, which was the U.S. versus Kaufman. And Kaufman was convicted of forced labor, involuntary servitude, and healthcare fraud for residential care homes in Kansas. They ran several treatments, Ellen and Linda Kaufman, and they ran them for more than 20 years. They stole all of the Social Security benefits from the patients and charged Medicare for all the services. As a part of their treatment, Kaufman forced the actual patients to perform labor nude. It was all manual labor, and recorded videos, acts of sex acts. And so that's something that we have to really watch when it comes to our residential homes to ensure that you don't have labor trafficking going on there as well as sex trafficking.
So some additional resources, like we had mentioned earlier, Disability Rights Ohio is a local nonprofit, but their report that they put out in 2015, I think outlines it outlines how big the issue is when it comes to sexual abuse and sexual misconduct, and how as a state system we might have missed opportunities to help people when they were in trafficking situations because we allowed those surface labels to be as far as we looked. We didn't go beneath the surface to look at how often this is occurring, how many other people has this occurred with, what types of force, fraud, or coercion are in place here. But we saw the surface act as being something sexual in nature and abusive in nature, so they kind of stopped there where the label was. Another one was Ohio's Department of Developmental Disabilities. They put out health and welfare alerts locally or throughout all 88 counties on an annual basis. At one point in time, they had released ones for the sexual abuse prevention and reporting, as well as indicating the risks and patterns for sex and labor trafficking as well with our population. It is a way to keep it on the forefront of people's thinking in the field, but then also to be utilized as an educational opportunity for those that we support.
And some of our other resources that we have are some of our other resources that we have, just to share, that there are human trafficking fact sheets that come out, and those are really interesting to review because it'll tell you just certain tips and things to look for. And then you have other just like the I think it's a National Human Trafficking Disabilities Work Group. It's a really good organization, and it works with disability actual agencies throughout all 50 states. And we do these conversations by phone, and we put together webinars and all of that too, so that we really are taking a national interest in what's happening with our individuals when it comes to human trafficking.
And this is really good to see because, you know, as we know, it's a worldwide problem, but getting some specific attention around those with developmental disabilities. This is a minority group that any one of us could be a part of at any point in our life. And for them to be targeted in these situations, we have, as a country, as a society, as a culture, we should stand up and have outrage. Not that any other population that is at risk shouldn't be outraged by this, but when you look at our most vulnerable individuals and they're having to be put in these scenarios, that's something that I think speaks volumes, that we cannot stand aside silently. We have to speak up, stand up, and do something about it.
If you ever need any help, you have me and Steve here. Just give us a call. We're here to support you throughout the state of Ohio. We even cross lines to go in other states if we have to. So we appreciate your time. Thank you.